I never imagined a family barbecue, something so familiar. So ours would end with me clawing at the surface of a lake, lungs burning, while my grandson laughed from the dock. Brandon. My sweet Brandon. At least that's who he used to be. At 19, he was tall, lean, and cocky. That day he grinned an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes and shoved me his own grandmother into the water. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a prank that went too far. It was calculated, cruel. I heard him before I felt the shove. "Come on, Grandma," he taunted. "Let's see if you still know how to swim." Then cold hands on my back, a forceful push. My body twisted in midair, and I screamed, but no one moved. My feet left the dock, and I hit the lake like a dropped anchor. The shock was instant. It stole my breath. My limbs locked up. My chest burned as I tried to scream again, only to inhale a lungful of muddy water. I hadn't swum in over 3 decades, not since the surgery on my shoulder. My doctor had warned me, don't risk it. Not with brittle bones and unreliable reflexes. And still not a single person on the dock flinched. I thrashed, floundered, panic seared through me. When I finally surfaced, gasping and coughing, I caught a glimpse of their faces. Brandon, arms folded, laughing. My son Brandon's father just stood there, and my daughter-in-law. She took a slow sip of wine and muttered, "She's being dramatic." I don't remember how I got out. Maybe instinct, maybe fear, maybe some scrap of strength I forgot I had. But when I finally dragged myself onto the dock, soaked and shivering, knees scraped and heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe, no one helped. No one. Brandon looked down at me and smirked. "Well, guess you can still swim. Tough old bird." They laughed. All of them. That laughter followed me long after the moment passed. It rang in my ears like sirens. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I stood up drenched and humiliated. And in that moment, I thought of Eleanor, my best friend. Just last week, she'd told me, people show their true colors when they think you need them. God, how right she was. I walked slowly back toward the picnic table, my clothes clinging to my skin, aching from the inside out. They had already gone back to flipping burgers, popping open another bottle of wine, as if I hadn't almost died right in front of them, as if it were just another summer laugh. No apology, no concern, just nothing. And I knew this was it. This was the moment the curtain finally fell. The moment I stopped making excuses for their behavior. The moment I stopped clinging to the memory of the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. Brandon was gone. What stood in his place was a boy raised in a home where image mattered more than empathy. Where cruelty was passed off as confidence. Where love didn't come with responsibility, only expectation. I sat at the table dripping in silence. They used to mistake that silence for weakness. Not anymore. This time it was a vow, a warning, a beginning. Because as I looked out at that dock at my family, laughing while my chest still heaved with leftover panic, I realized something they had clearly forgotten. I still had choices. And one of those choices held Brandon's future college fund. Ready for part 2? Reply. Continue with part 2, and I'll keep the narrative going with the same style, voice, and intensity, one part at a time. Bandanai. Continue with part 2. ChatGPT Danai. Absolutely. Here is part 2 of the rewritten story. Part 2. Ghost in my own home. Back at the house, I peeled off my wet clothes and dried off with an old guest towel, the kind no one else ever touched. I stood in the bathroom mirror, hair tangled, knees red and raw, eyes bloodshot from the lake water. I looked like a ghost, but I wasn't dead. Not yet. When I stepped into the kitchen there, they were chatting about vacation plans like I hadn't just been shoved into a lake. Brandon was scrolling on his phone barefoot, his damp swim trunks dripping onto my freshly cleaned tile. My son Mark leaned against the counter, drinking the lemonade I made that morning. And Amanda, my daughter-in-law, perfect in her polished indifference, was showing Brandon pictures of beach resorts in Cancun. No one looked at me. No one asked if I was okay. Not even a dry blanket. I sat down quietly at the edge of the kitchen table, my cardigan still soaked and clinging to my back, my hands trembling from the cold, but they didn't notice. They didn't care. And in that moment, I didn't want to scream out of pain. I wanted to scream out of disbelief. How did we get here? Because there was a time, God, I remember it when Brandon would wrap his tiny arms around my neck and whisper, "You're the best part of this house, Grandma." I remember Sunday mornings, Pancakes cartoons, his little head nestled against my shoulder. Now he mimicked me drowning in front of his friends and laughed. That kind of cruelty, it doesn't just appear overnight. It's taught, nurtured in silence and smirks, and I knew exactly where he learned it. From the eye rolls, the passive-aggressive jokes about my old ways, the moments Mark and Amanda dismissed me, used my home, my time, my money, and made me feel like a burden instead of a human being. I sat there shivering in my own kitchen while they planned their next escape, a trip to Cancun, the 4th vacation they'd taken this year. I let the silence stretch, let it sit heavy in the room like a fog. I waited to see if any of them would turn notice care. They didn't, so I stood, calm, still. Like always, I walked to my bedroom and shut the door gently behind me. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed where I used to read Brandon bedtime stories. The same bed where he once cried when he scraped his knee and needed me to tell him angels don't age. The lake water was gone from my skin, but not from my bones. That ache stayed, that shame, that slow-burning truth I'd been drying off from for years. Every missed birthday, every, "Can I borrow just a little more?" with no thanks. Every dinner where I was talked over, laughed at, or entirely ignored. That push into the lake, that was just the first time they did it where others could see. I opened my nightstand drawer and pulled out my journal. Just a simple leather one I kept hidden between the bills and the old photographs. I wrote one sentence: "They will never get the chance to drown me again." Because tonight wasn't about getting dry. It was about waking up. That night, long after the house was still and silent, I sat at my desk. The old lamp buzzed gently beside me. I couldn't sleep, not with that image looping through my mind, Brandon's face, his smirk, his laughter as I struggled beneath the surface. It wasn't just cruel, it was personal, because I didn't just visit him on holidays. I didn't send birthday cards and call it love. No, I raised that boy. When Mark lost his job again and the bank started calling, Brandon didn't go to some foster home or family shelter. He came here, to me, to my arms. I fed him, bathed him, held him through night terrors. I was his emergency contact on every school form. I paid his tuition when his parents were too tight that month. I even bought him his first piano. Secondhand, but still it cost me half my savings. He sat on the living room floor for hours that day, touching each key like it held a secret. "Grandma," he said, "this is better than Christmas." And I remember thinking, this child feels deeply. So where did he go? I thought maybe it was just teenage years. At 16, he stopped sitting at the dinner table. Thanks became grunts. He barely looked me in the eye. I told myself he's just growing, but he didn't grow. He hardened. The small signs added up. The way he mocked the way I stirred tea, rolled his eyes when I told family stories, talked over me like I was background noise. I should have said something, but I was afraid of rocking the boat, of losing the version of him I still held on to. Instead, I lost myself. I let his parents laugh when he dismissed me. I let them act like I was wallpaper in my own home. The boy who once kissed my cheek and asked if angels got older was now a stranger standing in my kitchen, joking about how I looked, gasping for air. And worst of all, some small, broken part of me still wanted to believe there was a trace of that sweet child somewhere inside him. But tonight, I let that fantasy die. I pulled out the last photo album, gap-toothed smiles and cake candles, and put it back on the shelf. Not to forget, to protect myself. Because love without boundaries isn't love, it's servitude. And I've served enough. Let his parents sort out what they created. Let them brag about his GPA, his Instagram likes, his wit. I wasn't going to be their footnote anymore. The next morning, I told Eleanor everything. Because when you're drowning, sometimes all you need is one person who listens. And she always had. Ready for part 3? Reply. Continue with part 3, and I'll continue the journey. Band and I Continue with part 3. ChatGPT deny. Absolutely. Here's part 3 of the rewritten story. Part 3. Muffins and momentum. The next morning, there was a knock at the kitchen door. Not the front, never the front. Eleanor had always come through the side like the house owed her entry. "Open up, June," she called out. I brought muffins and opinions. I hadn't even made it to the door before I smiled. There she stood, oversized sunglasses, turquoise windbreaker, clutching a brown paper bag and 2 coffee cups, like she was storming a battlefield. Always dramatic, always right on time. "You look like hell," she said as she breezed in. "Sit, I'll pour." And I did. Because with Eleanor, you didn't argue. You just received. She moved like she belonged there, like she always had. In some ways, she did. 30 years of friendship gave her that right. Through deaths, births, breakdowns, and miracles, she'd never once flinched. "They did something," she said, not even bothering with the muffin bag yet. I nodded. Just once. That was all she needed. She didn't gasp. Didn't say, "Oh, honey." She leaned forward, elbows on the table, coffee steaming between us. "Then it's time," she said. Time for what I asked, though. I already knew. Eleanor reached into her tote, not for the muffins, not for napkins, but for a manila folder. She slid it across the table like a dealer in a high-stakes game. "My lawyer's card. And a list of every financial account you told me about last year when we did your taxes. I kept it." "Of course I did." "You kept this," I whispered. "I keep everything she said. Especially when my best friend is handing out her love and legacy like Halloween candy to people who'd throw her into a damn lake." I stared at the name on the card, Philip Atwood. Estate law. Clean font. Firm handshake kind of guy. No nonsense. "I don't know," I whispered. "It feels final." Eleanor sat back, arms crossed. "No, it feels like freedom. You're not afraid of final. You're afraid of guilt. Different things." She took a slow sip from her cup and tapped the table. "Let me remind you what you've done for these people." I looked down, but she kept going anyway. "You paid for Brandon's school, his braces, his piano, for God's sake. You funded his soccer trips. You let his parents live rent-free in your lake house for an entire summer and still had to buy your own groceries that August." "I wanted to help," I murmured. "I know," she said softly. "Because you're better than them. That's the problem." We sat in silence for a minute. The sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, lighting up the dust in the air like floating ghosts. Outside, the azaleas were blooming. Cliff planted those the year we celebrated our 30th anniversary. Said they were stubborn flowers, slow to open, but impossible to kill. I felt like that now. "I don't want revenge," I finally said. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Of course not. You want release, and you deserve it." She tugged me gently up by the shoulders. "Get dressed. We're going into town. You're going to eat something that didn't come out of a box, and then we're calling Philip." "I haven't been to the cafe in months," I said, feeling a strange pull in my chest. Like fear, but also relief. "Perfect," she grinned, grabbing her keys. "Let them see what strength looks like in cardigans and crow's feet." We drove with the windows down, wind curling through my thinning hair. And somewhere between my driveway and Main Street, something clicked inside me. A breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for decades released. I hadn't felt this alive in years. The cafe was crowded warm, with the clatter of mugs, chairs scraping, and the low hum of weekday conversations. Eleanor stirred sugar into her espresso like she was mixing a potion, then slid the second cup across the table to me. "Drink up," she said. "You'll need caffeine and backbone." She wasn't wrong. After lunch, we drove straight to Philip's office. He met us in a small, book-lined room with too many diplomas and not enough warmth, but he looked me in the eye when he shook my hand. "I'm told you brought everything he said. Let's take a look." I pulled out the binder Cliff and I had built after his stroke. The original trust papers, insurance details, the letter we drafted when we first opened Brandon's college fund. He flipped through the documents, slowly, eyebrows climbing, as he did. $50,000, he asked. I nodded. Started putting it aside when Brandon was 10. Birthday checks, refunds, bonuses. Cliff and I even skipped a vacation that year. Is it all still there? Untouched, I said. He's in community college right now. Claims he wants to transfer next year. Philip leaned back in his chair. So, he said gently, "What do you want to do?" "Reallocate. Change the beneficiary. Shut it down entirely." I stared at the ceiling for a long moment. My hands were folded tight in my lap. "Nothing," I whispered. "Not yet." Philip tilted his head. "You want to wait?" "No," I said, voice low and even. "I want to watch." He blinked. "Watch what?" "I want to see how they treat me when they think I'm fragile. When they believe they're inches from inheriting. I want to see who pretends to care and who actually does." He closed the file slowly, as if sealing a chapter. "That's cold," he said. "No," Eleanor cut in. "It's survival." Philip nodded once. "Fair enough." We left an hour later, my legal life intact, but something inside me shifted. The fund wasn't a gift anymore. It was a mirror. That evening, back at home, I moved through the house like a stranger. Every room felt like a museum of a life I no longer lived in. I paused at the fireplace where Brandon's baby photo still sat, dimpled cheeks, bowl cut, eyes full of innocence. I didn't take it down. Not yet. Instead, I went to the kitchen table, pulled out my journal, and opened to a new page. At the top I wrote, "Let's see who loves me without the money." Then I drew 2 columns. Notices. Avoids. I didn't have to write Brandon's name. I already knew where he belonged. This wasn't about vengeance. This was clarity. Because for all their planning, for all their whispered schemes, for every conversation about what happens when Grandma's not around anymore, they forgot one thing. I still have the pen, and I'm not done writing my ending. Ready for part 4 reply. Continue with part 4, and I'll continue the next chapter in June's journey. Ban Danai, continue. ChatGPT Danai, certainly. Here's part 4 of the rewritten story. Part 4. The performance. I started small. A stumble here, a slower step there. Pausing mid-sentence, like I'd forgotten what I was saying. Letting my hand tremble just enough when pouring tea so that the cup gently rattled against the saucer. And almost immediately the energy shifted. Not to concern, not to kindness, but to annoyance. Brandon stopped saying hello when he walked in. Now at best, I got a grunt. At worst, he didn't even acknowledge me. If I asked him to help bring in groceries from the car, he'd sigh so loudly you'd think I'd asked him to push it up a hill. One night, I asked if he could carry in a bag of dog food, and he muttered, "You know, Grandma, if you can't even lift a bag, maybe it's time we had that talk." That talk. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. Mark began whispering in the kitchen when he thought I was asleep. "She's getting worse. I don't think she's taking her meds. I can't keep cleaning up after her." Amanda was even bolder. She didn't pretend anymore, not even around the church people she was usually so polished for. One evening, she said loudly, and with that rehearsed tone of faux concern, "She left the stove on again. Mark, what if Brandon was here alone?" He was always here alone. Not that they ever worried about him. No, I was the risk. The inconvenience. Thing is, I never left the stove on. I checked it, then checked again. Before bed, I'd peek back in every knob, turned off everything secure. I wasn't forgetting anything, but I let them believe it. Let them build their little narrative of decline. They thought they were playing chess. They didn't realize I was already playing a longer game. At night, I'd lie in bed and listen through the thin walls. I never heard my name. Just her. Just she. She's becoming a burden. She doesn't even know how to manage her money anymore. That last one almost made me laugh out loud. Because I did know how to manage my money. Every penny of it. The ledgers lived in my sock drawer. Clean columns, no debts, no mistakes. The college fund untouched. The equity in the house entirely mine. No one had access but me and Philip, and yet they counted me out like I was already gone. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and found Brandon and Amanda hunched at the table whispering. They froze when they saw me, but not before I heard the word. Facility. Brandon glanced at me like I was some object they'd need to figure out how to store. She didn't hear that he muttered. I walked past them, poured myself coffee slowly. Let the silence settle like fog. I stared out the window at the garden Cliff and I had built from dirt and sweat and Saturdays. The hydrangeas were blooming again. Stubborn things, just like us. I'm old, I said out loud. But I'm not deaf. Neither of them responded. They didn't even pretend. That's when I knew they weren't just waiting for me to decline. They were pushing, nudging, just enough to justify the plan already forming in the back of their minds. So I let them keep thinking I was slipping. Let them talk. Let them whisper. I made myself smaller in their eyes so that when I finally disappeared, they wouldn't be surprised, but they'd still feel it. That night, I opened my journal again, drew a hard little line next to Brandon's name under the avoids column, underlined it twice. Next to Mark and Amanda's names, I wrote, "They want the house, not the woman in it." I closed the book and smiled in the dark. Let them whisper, because I was listening to every word. A week later, the final moment came. Amanda planned it, a casual backyard dinner for her yoga friends and Mark's office buddies. "We'll grill," she said. "Keep it easy. Maybe you can make that lemon cake everyone likes." I didn't say anything, but I baked the cake anyway, out of habit, maybe a little out of sentiment. I didn't plan to stay. The house filled with the scent of grilled meat and rosé perfume. Laughter spilled from the patio like smoke. Thin, clinging, suffocating. I stayed inside, in the kitchen, where no one looked for me anymore. Not even Mark, the same boy who used to peek in while I cooked and ask if he could help stir. I stood by the sink, hidden behind a curtain of voices, always listening. Then I heard Brandon's voice, loud, sharp, soaked in the kind of sarcasm that's been passed down like inheritance. "So get this," he said, addressing the semicircle of well-dressed strangers. "Grandma fell in the lake at our last family barbecue. I swear she flailed around like a flipped turtle. All, 'Help me, help me.'" Laughter erupted. He wasn't done. I told her, "You're not even drowning," he said. She was probably just angling for sympathy. "You know how old people are. They weaponize helplessness." Someone nearby muttered, "That's dark, man." Brandon laughed even harder. "Nah, she's fine. Tough old bird. Tough old bird." That's what I was to him now. Not the woman who stayed up all night when he couldn't breathe as a child. Not the one who put every drawing he ever made in a folder under her bed. Not the one who made his Halloween costumes by hand and read every college application essay like it was scripture. Just a bird. Some tired, irrelevant relic. I stood behind the sliding glass door, my hands trembling. Not from age. From rage. And then I heard Amanda, her voice cutting through the night like a clean knife. "She's a liability," she whispered to someone. "Not family." I didn't move, didn't gasp, didn't cry. But something in me shifted. Because this wasn't the first time I felt disposable, but it would be the last. I turned and walked to my bedroom. Quiet, calm, clear. Sat on the bed, closed the door behind me, and felt something strange inside me. Not grief, not anger, finality. The contract had been signed the moment Brandon pushed me into that lake. Now I was signing it back. I opened the nightstand drawer and pulled out Philip's card, dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. "It's June," I said. "I'm ready." He didn't ask what I meant. He just said, "Come in tomorrow. Bring the documents. Bring your ID." "I already have," I said. When I hung up, the house was still alive with their laughter, their gossip, their plans. I walked back to the kitchen. The lemon cake still sat on the counter, untouched. I cut one slice, not for them. For me, I ate it alone at the table, slow and steady. Let them toast and brag and pretend I was invisible. Because tomorrow, they'd find out just how invisible I could become. And when the silence came, it wouldn't be weakness. It would be my exit. Ready for part 5. Reply. Continue with part 5, and I'll carry on with the next chapter of June's quiet, powerful transformation. Ban Danai. Continue. ChatGPT Danai. Absolutely. Here's part 5 of the rewritten story. Part 5. A quiet goodbye. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the same little desk where I used to help Brandon draft his essays, scholarship applications, personal statements, college dreams I believed in more than he did. The desk light buzzed gently overhead, its glow a quiet witness to everything I was about to do. I opened my laptop. The scholarship foundation Cliff and I used to support was still bookmarked. We donated to them for years, quietly, anonymously. Their motto had always struck me: education should be earned, not inherited. I clicked through the site. No hesitation, no second guessing, just clarity. Amount to donate $50,000. Donor name: in memory of Clifford James Winters. Designation: STEM Scholarship Fund for first-generation students. Anonymous, yes. I stared at the screen for a moment. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. I thought of Brandon at 9 years old, missing teeth, starry eyes. Grandma, he said, once I want to build machines that help people breathe better. He doesn't talk like that anymore. He doesn't talk to me at all. Confirm. It was done. No extra login. No confirmation email. Just a clean, irreversible click. And with it, I released something I didn't even know I was still holding. Then I opened a second tab. Amtrak. One-way ticket. Departure: Sunday morning. Destination: Silver Pines. A retirement community 2 states away. Eleanor's cousin had moved there last fall and called it peaceful, but not dead. Gardens? Workshops? People who played chess without cheating. Perfect. I chose the earliest train, quiet, unnoticed, while the house still slept. Then I packed. 1 small suitcase, 3 sweaters, my gardening gloves, Cliff's old flannel, my leather journal, and a photo of me holding baby Brandon. Just one. Not for guilt, not for nostalgia. For documentation. Everything else already gone. The valuables moved, the documents secured. What I left behind were shells. Clothes no one had seen me wear in years. Appliances no one thanked me for using. Cards I'd written for birthdays they barely remembered. Let them keep all of it. Let them sort through my leftovers like vultures circling what they slowly killed. Friday evening, I stood in the kitchen doorway, suitcase by the door. I'm heading out with Eleanor this weekend, I said, not bothering to fake a smile. She wants company on a little road trip. Mark didn't even look up from his phone. Cool, he muttered. Brandon brushed past me toward the fridge, said nothing. Amanda was the only one who responded. Drive safe, she said, folding laundry, barely glancing in my direction. She looked more concerned about separating the whites from the colors than where I was actually going. Not one of them asked where. Not one of them asked why. No one offered to carry my bag. It wasn't just neglect anymore. It was strategy. They were done pretending. In their minds, I had already been boxed up, labeled, and shelved. Grandma's just old. She probably won't be around much longer. Let her go. We'll be here when the will is read. The suitcase sat by the front door all evening. They walked past it like it was furniture. I watched them glance at it, calculated, passive, indifferent. No one asked when I'd be back. And honestly, they were right not to, because I wasn't coming back. Not to this house, not to these people. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked around. The walls that once echoed with Brandon's giggles now just watched me in silence. The handprints from painting projects, the chipped molding Cliff never got around to fixing. All of it still quiet, hollow. The alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. I got up like I was moving through time, brushed my hair, folded my blanket, wrote nothing, said nothing. At 600 sharp, Eleanor's car pulled up. Headlights low, engine humming like a secret. I paused at the front door, looked at the house that held my whole life, and the people who slowly drained the meaning out of it. There was no pain, only space. I stepped out, suitcase in hand, closed the door behind me. Soft, final. No one stirred, not even Brandon. As Eleanor drove toward the station, she glanced at me from the driver's seat. They didn't ask where you were going, did they? I shook my head. Didn't even look up. She made a sound, part scoff, part pity. Imagine that. You disappear and no one even notices. I prefer it that way, I said. And I did. At the train station, we hugged like we always had, firm and fast. No drama. She slipped a small envelope into my hand. Just in case, she said. I nodded. We didn't cry. Women like us who've lived through births, deaths, and everything in between, we don't cry over freedom. The train pulled in with a long exhale of steel and steam. I boarded with my small bag and sat by the window. The town faded behind me, replaced by trees. Then sky. Then the unknown. And I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for years. This wasn't a runaway. It was a rebirth. Back in that house, they wouldn't even notice I was missing until the freezer was empty. The laundry piled up, and the woman they once called Grandma had quietly stopped being convenient. They didn't say goodbye, but they'd feel my absence, and that's a goodbye they'd never forget. Ready for part 6? Reply. Continue with part 6, and I'll bring you into Silver Pines and June's new life. Bandanai. Continue. ChatGPT Danai. Of course. Here's part 6 of the rewritten story. Part 6. A new kind of quiet. Silver Pines was exactly what Eleanor had promised. Quiet but not lonely. Peaceful but still alive. Birdsong in the morning. Shuffling slippers in the hallway. The low hum of a classical radio drifting from a neighbor's open window. My room was small but clean. A bed by the window. A shelf for my books. A sturdy chair that didn't creak when I sat in it. I hung Cliff's old flannel on the hook by the door. I unpacked the photo of baby Brandon and placed it on the windowsill, not as an invitation for memories, but as a monument, a reminder of what once was, and what would never be again. I stared at that photo for a long time and finally saw the truth. He was just a boy I loved, not a man who deserved to own me. That afternoon, I sat down at my new desk and began writing. Not in my journal. Not a list of who avoids and who notices. A letter. Not to Brandon alone. To all of them. Mark. Amanda. Brandon. Their names at the top like a heading on an obituary. And then I began. I was the one who stayed up when Brandon couldn't sleep. I was the one who paid for his schooling, his braces, his future. I was the one who never missed a birthday even when you forgot mine. I listened. I waited. I hoped. In return, you mocked my fear. You minimized my needs. You treated my presence like clutter. And you laughed when I drowned. I paused. Put my hand on my chest. Felt the beat beneath my fingers. It wasn't racing anymore. Not like it used to when I'd confront them, voice shaky, hands trembling, still begging to be seen. Now it beat steadily, calm, certain. I picked the pen back up. This isn't revenge. I'm not punishing you. But I will no longer fund people who treat my love like leverage. The university fund is gone. The inheritance will follow. I have given enough, and now I choose peace. At the bottom, I didn't write Love Grandma. I signed it, June, Evelyn Winters, because that's who they forgot existed. Not just Grandma, not just Mom, a full woman with boundaries and breath left in her lungs. I folded the letter, sealed it in a plain envelope. No return address, no money. No photos. Just truth. On the way to the post office, I passed the community garden. A few of the residents were already at work planting squash and tomatoes, kneeling in the soft dirt. One of them, an older man with sun-darkened hands, looked up and nodded. First year here? He asked. Yes, I said. Good place, he replied, as if that said everything. No one asked you to prove your worth here. I smiled. Truly smiled. That's why I came. That evening, I brewed tea and watched the trees sway outside my window. I didn't check my phone. I hadn't brought one. If they needed to talk, they could figure out how to do it without control, without tracking, without leverage. Because I had already said everything I needed to say. And now they'd have to sit with it. It took exactly 5 days. 5 days from when I dropped that letter in the mailbox to the first ripple hitting the shore. Philip emailed me first. He rarely used punctuation, but this one came with a subject line that made me chuckle. Subject, they panicked. Hard. He wrote, Mark came to the office this morning. Looked 10 years older and 20 pounds of panic lighter. Brandon opened the letter at breakfast. Probably expected a check or some sweet little sentiment. Instead, he found your truth. No screaming, no begging, just your words. And the line that really knocked the wind out of them. The university fund is gone, redirected to a foundation that values decency over entitlement. Brandon turned red. Amanda started swearing. Mark, he kept saying the same thing like a prayer. We thought she'd wait. Wait for what? To be respected. To be useful enough again. To die. No, I had done enough waiting. That same day, Philip delivered the rest of the paperwork. Official confirmations that the trust was dissolved. That the accounts were locked, that all correspondence now had to go through him. He told them flatly, she's listed herself as unreachable, and she's well within her rights. I didn't hear the screaming, but I could picture it. Amanda pacing like a caged animal, furious that her careful calculations had just collapsed. Mark staring at his hands like maybe they could squeeze a different past from his palms. Brandon sweet smug. Brandon, finally realizing that mocking someone into silence doesn't work when that someone has left the room entirely. No phone number, no address, no access, just absence. That evening, I sat on the balcony of my new apartment. Wrapped in a blanket Eleanor had crocheted years ago. Tea in hand. Watching a pair of sparrows argue over a potted plant. It was quiet. But not the empty kind. The earned kind. The kind of quiet you sit in because you've done the screaming already. And I felt no guilt. No second guessing. No ache in my chest. Because for the first time, the distance between us felt honest. They wanted me small. Compliant. Grateful. Now they had it. But not in the way they expected. No more help with bills, no emergency loans, no free childcare, no college fund. Just silence, just space. And me, June Evelyn Winters. Still breathing, still living, just elsewhere. They'll call it abandonment. Tell people I lost it. Say I ran away. Let them. Because someday when the dust settles, they'll remember this. I gave everything I had until it almost killed me. And then I stopped. Not because I was cruel, but because I finally understood. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep people warm. And I refuse to be their matchstick ever again. Ready for part 7? Reply. Continue with part 7 and I'll show you how they begin to unravel. Ban Danai. Continue. ChatGPT Danai. Certainly. Here's part 7 of the rewritten story. Part 7. Echoes and Earthquakes. 3 days after Philip sent the legal notices, he forwarded me the first desperate email. Subject line, urgent. Please call us Mom. It was from Mark. Sloppy formatting, missing punctuation, panic leaking through the keyboard. We just need to talk. We're not mad. We're just really confused. Brandon's distraught. Amanda's overwhelmed. Please, just let us explain. We didn't know you were this upset. Please just call us. Explain what exactly? That I imagined the water in my lungs. That I misunderstood their laughter. That being called a liability wasn't what it sounded like. No, they didn't want to talk. They wanted access. Philip asked if I wanted him to respond. I told him no. Let them sit in the silence they created. That same week, they tried calling the bank. Denied. Tried emailing the Scholarship Foundation. Denied. They even made the boldest move yet. They reported me missing. An officer actually showed up at Philip's office asking if there was concern for my safety. Philip, bless him, handed over the file and calmly said, Ms. Winters is of sound mind, left by choice, and is under no legal obligation to inform people she's actively protecting herself from. The next day, Brandon called Philip directly. He didn't answer. He forwarded me the voicemail with the subject line, They're scrambling. I didn't listen. Not because I wanted to revel in their panic, but because I needed to honor something more sacred. My right to walk away. There's a strange kind of guilt that creeps in when you stop mothering people who've grown addicted to your silence. It comes in waves. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe they'll change. But guilt is the price women pay when we're taught that love should hurt. And I wasn't paying it anymore. Instead, I spent that morning in the garden, kneeling in the soil, planting lavender and kale. The air smelled like fresh dirt and sunlight. My fingers pressed into the ground like I was asking the earth to begin again with me. That evening, Eleanor called. They're spiraling, she said. Word's starting to get around. Amanda's yoga friends are whispering. Oh, I said, sipping chamomile. One of them asked if you had dementia. I laughed. Not the polite kind, the freeing kind. Well, I said, I must be the most organized dementia patient they've ever seen. Eleanor paused. You sure you're okay with them thinking you're gone? I looked out the window at the sunset blazing over rows of marigolds. Cliff's favorite. I'm not gone, I said. I'm just not available. And that was the truth, wasn't it? They didn't lose me. They drove me out. They wanted me present, but only in service. Always ready, never needed, convenient, disposable. But now I was gone, but not missing. And for the first time, they were finally trying to listen. Only now it was too late for conversations. This wasn't a standoff. It was a departure. Philip called the next day. They're demanding a meeting, he said, face to face. I told him I had no interest. He said he could at least deliver my message, but only if I wrote it out myself. So I did. 1 page. Tight. Unflinching. Philip read it to them word for word in his office. Amanda wore her softest cardigan, the one she reserved for playing victim. Mark looked like he hadn't slept. Brandon. According to Philip, he looked like a child again, not remorseful, just stunned that the world wasn't bending to him anymore. Philip didn't warm them up. He didn't offer coffee. He slid the folder across the table and said, "This is from Miss Winters." And then he read, "To those who assumed my silence meant agreements. I gave everything once. I won't die twice. You took my time. You took my peace. You drained me while telling others you were looking after me. You mocked me as I drowned, then wondered why I didn't come up gasping for your approval. Let me be clear. The university fund is gone. The inheritance has been restructured. The house will be donated. My assets will not go to people who treated me like clutter waiting to be cleared. You will receive nothing from me in death because you gave me nothing of value in life. Not love, not respect, not care. You loved my money more than you ever loved me." Philip said the room went silent. Amanda flushed. Mark tried to interrupt. "She's lost her mind," he snapped. Philip raised a calm hand. "No, she found it." Then he finished reading with the line I had written in bold at the bottom. "Being alone is better than being used." And just like that, the fantasy, they'd built the inheritance, the control, the future they thought was already in escrow died quietly under fluorescent lights. Not with a fight, but with the truth. They walked out shell-shocked, not because they understood, but because they finally realized they had no argument left. The power they thought they had evaporated, and what remained was just the echo of everything they had taken for granted. I didn't need to be there. Some endings are best enjoyed from a distance. And this was one of them. Ready for Part 8? Reply. Continue with Part 8, and I'll show you what happened after the fantasy truly fell apart. Bandanai, continue. ChatGPT Danai. Of course, here's Part 8 of the rewritten story. Part 8. When the house stops breathing. Eleanor called the next morning. "Well," she said without preamble, "it's happening." I didn't even have to ask. "Brandon came home from the college financial office yesterday," she continued. "Stormed through the front door like a tornado with a manila folder and a mouth full of complaints. Let me guess," I said, smiling into my tea. "No one told me the money was gone," she mimicked in a perfect pitch of whiny entitlement. I could almost hear it. Amanda, sharp and tired, firing back. "Well, maybe if you hadn't laughed while your grandmother nearly drowned, you'd still have a future worth funding." And Mark, probably just standing there, rubbing his forehead, trying to rewrite the last 5 years in his head. Eleanor laughed. "He didn't go back to class, not even to pretend." I nodded, watching a bee hop from marigold to marigold outside my window. And when that refund check didn't show up, she added, "Oh boy." You could feel the panic from 3 zip codes away. He finally understood. This wasn't punishment. This was exclusion. The consequence of cruelty isn't always wrath. Sometimes it's absence. Meanwhile, the ripples kept spreading. At the grocery store, Eleanor overheard a clerk whisper, "Did you hear what happened to Amanda's mother-in-law?" Another added, "I heard she just vanished." A third chimed in, "Maybe she's dead." "She's not dead," Eleanor told them loud enough for the produce section to hear. "She's just done." That afternoon, she called me with the update. "They said you disappeared," she reported, but I corrected them. "Oh," I said. "I told them no. She withdrew investment from a toxic enterprise." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my tea. Back at the house, the spiral picked up speed. Mark started drinking again. Slowly at first, just a beer with dinner, then whiskey, then bottles left uncapped on the counter. Amanda complained to her sister that my disappearance ruined everything. Not the lake, not the neglect, not the greed. No. The problem was me choosing to leave. They never once used the word left. That would have implied it was my decision. In their narrative, I was just missing. A ghost. A hole in their plan. But the neighborhood wasn't buying the story. Not anymore. Because people remember things. They remember who showed up with casseroles when their father died. Who baked cupcakes for every school fundraiser. Who folded chairs at church even when her back hurt. Who paid for their kids' braces when no one else could. They remembered me, and now I was gone. Their social circle didn't collapse. It just rotated without them. The people they depended on, the ones who smiled at potlucks, who invited them to barbecues, who offered congratulations and condolences, stopped calling. Amanda's yoga studio friends began distancing. No more brunch invites. No more text chains. They didn't want to be next in line for the fallout. Mark's church group gave him polite smiles, but no one invited him to speak at men's breakfast anymore. The rot wasn't dramatic. It was truth. Quiet, persistent, corrosive. As for Brandon, his friends began slipping away too. Without tuition to brag about, without spring break photos funded by my money, there wasn't much left. His phone, once a weapon of silence and sarcasm, spent more and more time face down. The house, once filled with noise, started feeling empty. Not because I took anything with me, but because I took the weight I used to carry emotionally, financially, spiritually, and left it where it belonged. On them, and now it was crushing them. One night, Eleanor called again. "You'll never believe what I just heard," she said. "What now?" I asked. Amanda was on the front porch screaming. I raised my eyebrows. "At Mark." "At the sky," Eleanor said. "At the air." She was yelling, "How dare she take everything?" I blinked. "Everything." "You left the curtains," Eleanor reminded me. "The dishes, the couch, the lemon cake recipe." The silence. And she was right. I didn't take everything. They still had each other. But I think they're starting to realize they only liked me quiet because my quiet held all the weight of their dysfunction. Now, that weight is theirs. And I'm here, on my balcony, wrapped in a blanket, warm drink in hand, listening to birds, not bickering. Surrounded by people who say please and thank you. People who see me, who don't expect anything in return. Let them sit in the silence, because it's not my job to fill it anymore. Ready for part 9, reply. Continue with part 9, and I'll continue June's journey as the legacy of her absence deepens. Ban, Danai continue. ChatGPT Danai. Certainly. Here's part 9 of the rewritten story. Part 9. The Ghost They Created. Back at the lake house, the walls had stopped absorbing sound. They echoed now. Every passive-aggressive remark, every sneer, every joke, told too loudly, all of it reverberated louder in my absence. Without me to soak up the tension, their dysfunction filled the air like smoke in a locked room. Eleanor called again, one morning, voice dry as ever. "They're unraveling." More than before, I asked, watching the sunrise paint soft gold across my quilt. "Oh, sweetie," she said. "Brandon's out of class, Amanda's avoiding the church women, and Mark's been seen at the liquor store twice this week before noon. You left them oxygen, and they're choking on it." I sipped my coffee slowly. "They still think I'm coming back." "Oh, they're not sure what they think anymore," she said. "I think they're hoping this is just your version of a tantrum." I smiled without warmth. They always assumed my boundaries were temporary. They tried to regroup Mark and Amanda especially. Rumors reached Eleanor whispered apologies, casual half-truths about Mom needing space. But it was too late for a cleanup campaign. They didn't just lose a caregiver. They lost the linchpin to the story they built around their own decency. Because that's the problem with depending on someone you quietly resent. Once they leave, there's no one left to absorb your failures. Philip sent me another email. Subject line, RE. They want closure. The message was brief. Amanda requested to meet in person. She says not to argue, just to talk. Wants to clear the air. I didn't even need to think about it. No, because air that foul doesn't need clearing. It needs to be left behind. I wrote back. I have nothing left to say. If they have something to confess, let them write it down. I'm no longer a witness for their redemption arc. I spent that afternoon in the community garden. Quiet rows of carrots and basil. A new resident named Harriet knelt beside me planting zucchini starts. She was in her early 70s, wore overalls like armor, and never spoke unless it mattered. We worked in silence until she finally asked, "You leaving something or running from it?" I thought for a moment. Neither, I said. I'm reclaiming what they buried. Harriet gave a slow nod. Good, she said. Tired women are the ones who finally change things. That night, I opened my journal again. The one I'd brought with me from the lake house. The page with the 2 columns was still there. Who notices, who avoids. Under avoids. Brandon's name was already there, underlined twice. Next to Mark and Amanda's names, I'd written, "They want the house, not the woman in it." Now I drew a new line across the bottom and wrote, They noticed too late. Because that's the thing, isn't it? They never stopped to ask who I was beyond what I gave them. Now they're mourning a ghost they themselves created. A few days later, I received a letter. Handwritten. No return address, but the penmanship was Mark's. I recognized it from birthday cards written decades ago. I hesitated before opening it. Inside it was 2 pages of clumsy regret. Not an apology, just explanation. We didn't realize. We were caught up in life. Things just got away from us. Brandon's young. Amanda never meant. Not once did he write, "I'm sorry." Not once did he say, "We were wrong." It ended with a sentence that made me set the paper down. If there's anything left you want to give, we'll accept it with gratitude. Give. As if love was still a transaction. As if my peace was just a rebrand of my usefulness. I didn't write back. I folded the letter, tucked it into the very back of my journal. Not to remember, just to know. Because sometimes it is important to have proof of the way people reveal themselves when they believe the giving is done. Later that evening, I joined a group of residents on the front porch. We sat in rocking chairs, watching the sky turn lavender. One of them, a woman named Ruth, passed around slices of warm banana bread and asked if anyone had heard from their families lately. There was a moment of quiet. Then someone said, "Mine only calls when they need something." Another added, "Mine only notices when I stop calling." And we all nodded like members of a quiet club. No tears, no bitterness, just the truth between women who've lived long enough to know the difference between being loved and being used. I didn't cry that night, not for Brandon, not for Mark, not for Amanda, not even for who they used to be, because I realized I wasn't grieving them anymore. I was grieving me, the version of myself who kept waiting for someone else's decency to show up and save me. She was gone now, and I didn't need her back. Ready for part 10? Reply. Continue with part 10, and I'll take you further into June's reclamation of her life on her terms. Bandanai. Continue. ChatGPT Danai. Of course. Here's part 10 of the rewritten story. Part 10. The life I didn't know. I could have. The days passed differently at Silver Pines. No one knocked on my door expecting favors. No one hovered outside the bathroom waiting to ask for money. No one rolled their eyes when I told a story for the second time. It was quiet, not the hollow kind I'd known in my own kitchen, but the earned kind. The kind that made room for thought, not guilt. I learned the rhythm of this place. Mornings meant tea on the porch and garden walks. Afternoons were for reading in the sunroom or helping Harriet alphabetize the shared pantry, which she did with military precision. Evenings brought chess games. I usually lost conversations I didn't have to moderate, and finally rest that felt like rest, not retreat. It was a soft, dignified kind of peace. And I realized something staggering. I hadn't felt like a person in years. One morning, a staff member named Olivia stopped by my room with a folder of upcoming activities. She was in her 30s, bright-eyed and kind in that genuine way you can't fake. "We're planning a storytelling night," she said, smiling. "We'd love if you shared something, maybe about your childhood, or Cliff." I paused. "Cliff," I echoed, letting the name settle. He'd like that. Later that day, I pulled out the box I'd brought from home, the one I hadn't opened since arriving. Inside were a few worn photographs, Cliff's old watch, and a bundle of handwritten letters we'd exchanged in the early years of our marriage. I opened the top one, creased and faded, and read the first line. "June, you've always been the quiet strength behind every loud miracle I've known." I smiled. Cliff had always seen me, even in silence, especially in silence. That evening, I sat on the porch with Harriet and Ruth. Someone passed around ginger snaps. Ruth asked, "If you could go back and change one thing, what would it be?" I didn't hesitate. I would have left sooner. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. Because every year I stayed waiting for someone to treat me like I mattered was a year I spent shrinking. I shrank every time I handed over money and didn't get a thank you. Every time I offered help and was met with entitlement. Every time I was talked about in the third person while still in the room. I was fading in the walls of my own house until I walked away. And suddenly, there I was again, whole and vivid and mine. A week later, Philip sent another update. Subject FYI. Brandon dropped out officially. Amanda was overheard telling a neighbor she broke this family, to which the neighbor reportedly replied, "No, she just stopped fixing it." I chuckled when I read that, loud and long, because finally someone saw it. They'd convinced themselves I'd fractured the foundation, but I didn't. I simply stopped spackling their cracks with my love. Amanda tried again. This time she mailed a letter. I knew it was hers before I even opened it. The envelope was thick with curated grief floral border fancy cursive, the kind of stationery that says, "I care louder than the person ever did." It began as expected. "I know things have been tense." It continued with soft gaslighting. "I'm sure we misunderstood each other. Brandon was just being a teenager. We didn't mean for you to feel, not be." The letter ended with the final plea. "We'd love to reconnect. Maybe you could come for Thanksgiving." There it was. The Reel You Back In holiday special. I folded the letter neatly and slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk. Not out of sentiment, but out of strategy. Because one day, if they ever ask why I didn't return, I want to remember the non-apology apology they sent when the inheritance slipped through their fingers. Eleanor came to visit the next weekend. She arrived in her usual glory-bright scarf, messy lipstick, and a travel mug that smelled like defiance. "I brought pumpkin bread and gossip," she announced. "You get to pick what we start with." "Bread first," I said, "then gossip. Let's keep priorities in order." We sat on the back patio in the shade of a blooming fig tree. Birds sang, wind rustled, and for a moment, we just listened. "You look taller," she said suddenly, half joking. "Maybe I am," I replied. "Maybe grief just hunches you down without asking." She nodded. "And freedom straightens you out again." Later, as we walked through the garden, she asked what I was planning next. "You've got time," she said. "You've got peace. What now?" I paused by a row of sunflowers, tall, unapologetic. "I think I'm going to plant something big," I said. "Something that outlives me." "You already did," she said gently. "Yourself." That night, I returned to my journal. Not the old one with the columns, a fresh one. The first page, blank, not heavy with lists of wrongs, not weighed down by disappointments, not designed to track avoidance or performance, just empty, inviting, like me. I picked up my pen and wrote a single line. This is where I start telling my story to myself, not through them. Ready for part 11. Reply. Continue with part 11, and I'll share how June begins planting a future rooted in joy, not justification. Ban Danai, continue. ChatGPT Danai. Absolutely. Here's part 11 of the rewritten story. Part 11. What grows without permission. Spring came early to Silver Pines that year. The trees outside my window burst into blossom almost overnight. One day, bare limbs, the next a riot of pink and white petals against the sky like joy couldn't be contained a moment longer. It felt like the garden and I had made the same decision to stop waiting for permission to bloom. Harriet and I started planting earlier than the rest of the residents, while others were still circling seed catalogs and debating which tomatoes yielded the best sauce Harriet was digging. And I was right there with her. We laid down rows of vegetables, yes, but we also tucked in marigolds, lavender snapdragons, things that had no nutritional value at all, only beauty, only purpose in existing without serving. And maybe that was the lesson. Not everything you grow has to be useful to someone else. On a warm Saturday, Olivia, the sweet young activities coordinator, asked if I'd consider mentoring a new resident. Her name was Tess, widowed, 64, recently retired and slightly terrified of the quiet. "She reminds me of you," Olivia said gently. I wasn't terrified, I said. "You were silent," she replied. "Same thing sometimes." That night, Tess knocked on my door at the exact time we'd planned. She brought a pie homemade slightly lopsided, but warm. "Apple," she said. "I used to bake it every Friday for my husband. I haven't since he passed." We sat by the window and ate in comfortable silence for several minutes. Then she finally said, "I keep thinking, who am I now?" I nodded slowly. "That's the right question, but don't rush the answer. Let it grow." Meanwhile, Eleanor had taken to calling every few days with her usual dramatic flair. Each call came with a new report from the ghost town, what she now called my old house. "You'll love this one," she said one afternoon. "Mark put the lake house on the market." I blinked. "He's selling it." "Trying to. But word travels. Apparently, a few neighbors have already made comments about how the place feels cursed. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "I'm not saying you cursed it. I'm just saying sometimes a house can only hold so much unspoken damage before it turns cold. And who'd want to live in a house where a family watched their mother nearly drown and called it a performance?" "Exactly," she said. "It's not haunted. It's just honest." That same week, Philip forwarded another email. Subject line, "Last attempt. Promise." It was from Amanda. It began, "We understand if you can't forgive us, but we want you to know the door is open." There was no apology, just open-ended regret. The kind that leaves responsibility vague and closure incomplete. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, because I was free. The following Sunday, I walked past the community's bulletin board and saw a small flyer someone had posted. Wanted. Volunteers to mentor teen girls from the local shelter weekly writing sessions and garden work. I stood there for a long moment. Then I added my name. The first day, the girls arrived with guarded faces and tight arms. Most were no older than 14. They sat with pencils in hand, unsure whether this was a punishment or a privilege. I asked them to write about a time they felt invisible. They didn't hesitate. Their words poured out like confession and fire. One girl, Maya, shared a paragraph so raw it left the room breathless. Her mother had left when she was 5. Her father barely spoke unless he was angry. She wrote, "I figured out a long time ago that if you stay quiet long enough, they stop expecting you to speak. That's when you get to think for yourself." When she looked up, I met her eyes, and I saw myself. Not as a girl, but as someone who survived by learning to shrink. I used to think silence was survival, I told her. But it was just the prelude to becoming someone new. By late spring, the garden behind Silver Pines was unrecognizable. Residents from neighboring buildings came to visit. Children from the shelter stopped by even when there wasn't a scheduled session. People began calling it the sanctuary, not official, just understood. And I realized I hadn't created a garden. I'd created proof that something beautiful can grow after neglect. That love, when redirected wisely, still bears fruit. One morning, I found a small envelope on my door. Inside was a card. "Thank you, Ms. June. I feel seen. Maya." On the back, she'd drawn a single sunflower. Tall, bright, rooted. Later that week, I added one final line to my new journal. "What I planted in myself is finally blooming, and no one gets to harvest it but me." Ready for part 12? Reply. Continue with part 12. And I'll show you how June's quiet freedom continues to ripple through the world she chose to build. Ban Danai. Continue. ChatGPT Danai. Certainly. Here's part 12 of the rewritten story. Part 12. The Woman in the Mirror. It had been almost 6 months since I left. The air at Silver Pines had changed with the season. The scent of blooming things gave way to freshly cut grass and jasmine carried in through open windows. Children's laughter drifted from the nearby community park in the evenings, echoing across the courtyard like a lullaby. And still, I hadn't once wished to go back, not even out of curiosity. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror in my room. No occasion, no visitor expected, just me, a brush, and the quiet. The face staring back looked older than I remembered, but not in a sad way. There were more lines, sure, softer edges, but there was something else. Weight. Not the burdensome kind I'd carried for decades, financial, emotional, invisible. But presence. I looked like someone who had finally come home to herself. That same week, I received a letter from Philip. No legal updates this time. Just a note typed in his usual clean format, clipped to a news article from the local paper. Silver Pines resident launches garden and writing program for local teens. There was a photo. Me standing among rows of sunflowers and lettuce, Maya at my side, holding a notepad. I hadn't known a photographer was there. Beneath the photo was the caption, "June, Evelyn Winters, 72, says she's just getting started." Philip's handwritten note at the bottom read, "They're going to see this. Just a heads up." I didn't dread it. If Mark or Amanda or Brandon saw my name in print, I hoped it landed like a mirror. A clear reflection of what I could be, what I always was when I wasn't busy holding them up. They didn't bury me. They just gave me enough silence to grow. Eleanor called the next day, voice buzzing with pride. "I bought 5 copies, she said. One for the rec room, one for the bulletin board, one for the shelter, one for Philip, and one to leave anonymously in Amanda's mailbox. I laughed. Subtle. She grinned. We're retired, not dead. Let the woman know you bloom with or without her applause. A few days later, Olivia asked if I'd be willing to speak at the local high school. Just a short talk to the seniors, part of their Life After Graduation series. I'm not exactly conventional, I warned. Exactly why we want you, she said. So I agreed. That Friday, I stood behind a small podium in a library filled with teenagers. Some looked bored. Others looked curious. One girl in the back had bright blue hair and eyes that didn't flinch. I cleared my throat. I was a grandmother when I finally started living like a person. A few kids sat up straighter. For most of my life, I thought love meant giving everything. Time, money, energy, forgiveness, even when it wasn't asked for. I gave and gave and gave, until one day I realized I wasn't even visible to the people I loved most. Just convenient. Silence, not awkward, respectful. I left, not out of anger, but because I finally believed I didn't have to be miserable to be meaningful. I paused. You don't owe your life to people who only recognize your worth when they need something. That girl in the back? She nodded. Later, one of the teachers came up to me, eyes misty. I think you just changed the trajectory of half this room. I shook my head. I just told the truth. They get to decide what to do with it. That night, I walked back to my apartment and found a small package waiting at my door. No return label, no handwriting I recognized. Inside was a card. It read, "You may never come back, but we'll never stop thinking about you." I stared at it for a long time. Then I turned it over. Nothing on the back. No name, no address, no apology. And I realized something. This wasn't for me. It was for them. A whisper into the void. The kind people send when they finally realize the door they always assumed was open is gone. That night, I wrote a new journal entry. I titled it, "When They Finally Saw the Light." I was already gone. And underneath, I wrote, I didn't need revenge. I needed a mirror. And now every flower I plant, every child I mentor, every truth I speak, that's the reflection they never expected. I am not the ghost of who they lost. I am the gardener of what they'll never grow. Ready for part 13. Reply. Continue with part 13, and I'll show you how June redefines legacy and chooses who gets to inherit it. Bandanai? Continue. ChatGPT Danai. Certainly, here's part 13 of the rewritten story. Part 13. The Inheritance of Intentions. It was a quiet morning when I walked into the Silver Pines common room and saw Maya sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by younger girls. She was helping them with their writing, correcting, gently listening, with her whole face holding space like someone twice her age. I didn't interrupt. I just stood in the doorway, watching a legacy unfold. Not the kind measured in property deeds or trust accounts. Something deeper, quieter, chosen. Later that day, Olivia approached me. "We've been contacted by the Scholarship Foundation," she said. "The one you donated to." I tilted my head. "Something wrong?" "No, quite the opposite. They want to start a mentorship arm, and they'd like you to help design it. You'd be sort of a founding voice." I blinked. "Me, you," she said, smiling. "They said your donation letter was one of the most powerful things they've ever read." I hadn't thought anyone but the fund manager would even see it. I remembered writing that line in the memo field, in memory of Clifford James Winters, "Education should be earned, not inherited." It was never meant to be seen as a mission statement, but somehow it became one. I spent the next week working with their coordinator. We designed a mentorship framework built around self-worth, autonomy, and boundaries. Not just test prep and college forms, lessons in recognizing your own value before the world tries to define it for you. One afternoon, I closed the draft proposal and stared at the title at the top of the page. The June Winters Initiative. I hadn't chosen the name. They had. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to downplay it. I just smiled. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued feeding me breadcrumbs from the ghost town. "You'll appreciate this," she said on our Thursday call. "Brandon applied to a private scholarship last week. Got rejected." I raised an eyebrow. "Academics?" "No." "Behavior?" she said. Apparently, one of the committee members found an old social media post he made, the one where he joked about pushing his grandma into the lake. The same joke that once made his friends laugh. Now it was a stain, a record. Actions echo. Mark and Amanda were quieter now. Not repentant, just silenced. The lake house hadn't sold. The market cooled. The neighborhood cooled faster. Eleanor drove by once and said the shutters were drawn like the house itself was ashamed. They used to hold court on that back patio, she said. Now it's weeds and peeling paint. You didn't burn that bridge, June. You just refused to carry it anymore. One morning, a package arrived at the Silver Pines front desk addressed to me. Inside was an envelope, the edges frayed, as if it had been carried in someone's purse for a while. It was from Brandon. The letter was short, hesitant, written in a loopy, uneven scrawl I hadn't seen since he was 13. I know you probably won't read this. I don't blame you. I don't remember when I stopped seeing you as a person, only that I did, and I'm sorry. That word, sorry. I read it again, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to believe it cost him something. I didn't cry. I just folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with Maya's sunflower drawing and the scholarship proposal. Not forgiveness, not closure, just documentation. That afternoon, I walked to the garden and pruned the lavender. A new girl from the shelter joined me, quiet, thoughtful. She didn't say much, but after an hour of digging, she finally asked, "Why do you live here, Miss June? Doesn't your family miss you?" I smiled, clipping a stubborn stalk. My family misses the version of me that didn't have boundaries. She blinked. Is that bad? No, I said. It's necessary. Because the day you start choosing yourself, some people treat it like betrayal. But it's not. I shook my head. It's freedom. And anyone who can't stand to see you free was never rooting for you to begin with. Later that night, I opened my journal and flipped to a new page. At the top, I wrote, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you protect while you're still here." And beneath that, my legacy is not a house, not a fund, not a photo album. My legacy is that I survived being invisible and chose to become visible to the people who needed me, not just the ones who used me. Ready for part 14? Reply. Continue with part 14 and I'll bring you closer to June's final chapters where peace becomes her inheritance. Bant Danai. Continue. ChatGPT Danai. Of course. Here's part 14 of the rewritten story. Part 14. When peace becomes the inheritance. Summer settled over Silver Pines like a long exhale. The days stretched longer. The tomatoes in our garden burst red and sweet. Maya and the other girls came. Less often, school was out. Some had moved on, but when they did return, they came with journals, jokes, stories, and sometimes bruises. They didn't talk about, but didn't need to explain. We just sat in the garden, hands in dirt, letting silence be something kind. One late afternoon, Olivia stopped by my porch. "I've been meaning to tell you," she said, holding 2 iced lemonades like offerings. The foundation finalized the mentorship program's name. Oh, they're calling it the Winters Program. No first name this time. Just the name that built the foundation. I paused, then nodded. That's fitting. Winter teaches things too. That night, I walked the garden paths alone. The sun was setting slow gold, spilling across the hydrangeas. Cliff would have loved it. He always said dusk was the hour the earth caught its breath. I looked toward the bench where I used to sit with Brandon as a toddler. Of course, it wasn't the same bench, but it felt like one from a memory that belonged to someone else's body. There'd been so much love in that version of me, and so much pain in what came after. I let both coexist, because peace, I'd learned, doesn't come from erasing what happened. It comes from not letting it own you anymore. The next morning, Eleanor arrived earlier than usual. "I brought news and a cinnamon roll," she said. "You can choose which one to digest first." "Roll first," I said. "News goes down easier with sugar." We sat by the fountain as she handed me her phone. "You need to see this." On the screen was a photo from a real estate listing. "My old house, pending sale," she said. "They found a buyer, apparently. Young couple, first-time homeowners. The neighbors said they're teachers." I stared at the image. The lake in the background. The familiar porch. The flower beds Cliff once planted, wild and overgrown now, but still blooming in bursts of stubborn color. "They're going to repaint it," she added gently. "Tear out the carpet. Start fresh." I nodded. Let them. Let that house become something else. Let it forget me, because I wasn't haunting it anymore. Later, I opened my old recipe book, the one Amanda used to flip through with disinterest. I found the page for lemon cake and rewrote it by hand, neatly lovingly, onto a clean card. At the bottom, I added a note. For the next woman who finds herself expected to give more than she's allowed to keep, this cake is for you. Make it with joy, not obligation. I tucked it into a welcome basket the residents were putting together for the house's new owners. I didn't sign it. Some gifts don't need credit, only intent. That evening, I sat by my window watching dusk crawl across the garden when Olivia knocked lightly. "We're hosting a community dinner this weekend," she said. "Residents and some of the girls from the shelter. I think you should say a few words. Just something about why you stayed." I thought about that. Why I stayed. Why I didn't go back or rent a condo by the beach or move in with some distant cousin like people said women like me should. "I'll think about it," I said. And I did. When Saturday came, the tables were set with mismatched cloths and hand-picked daisies. Children chased each other between chairs, older residents swapped stories, and music drifted from a small speaker tucked behind a stack of pies. When it came time to speak, Olivia gave me a small nod. I stood up, not from obligation, but because I had something worth saying. I cleared my throat and smiled at the circle of faces, new ones, old ones, some scarred, some open. I used to think a good woman gave everything I began. Her time, her patience, her money, her silence. A few heads nodded, a few eyes blinked harder. But I've learned that a good woman doesn't disappear to be loved. She shows up for herself and for those who see her. And that is enough. I looked toward Maya and the girls, then Eleanor, then the garden. "I don't live in a house I paid for anymore," I continued. "I live in a life I chose." The room was quiet, not from tension, but from recognition. That night, I wrote in my journal. I didn't keep the house. I didn't keep the photo albums. I didn't even keep the last name they used to call me. But I kept myself. And that's the only inheritance I'll ever need. Ready for part 15? Reply. Continue with part 15, and I'll bring you the final chapter of June's journey, where closure doesn't come as a door slammed shut, but as a window quietly opened. Bandanai, continue. ChatGPT.nai. Absolutely. Here is part 15, the final chapter of June's story. Part 15, the goodbye they never heard. The leaves had begun to turn by the time I sat with the letter in my lap. Brandon's letter. The one with the word sorry tucked like a paper flower between years of silence. I hadn't decided what to do with it, whether to hold on to it as proof of growth or let it go like I'd let go of so many other things. That morning, I sat on the bench near the garden and read it one more time. It didn't sting the way it used to. His words didn't pull at old wounds, they simply landed like an echo in an empty room, soft, late, uneventful. I folded the letter and tucked it into a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a book I used to read aloud to him when he was young and still listened like every word mattered. Then I left the book on the community library shelf. Maybe someone else would find it. Maybe they'd never open the pages. Either way, I didn't need it anymore. Later that week, I asked Olivia if I could revise my beneficiary information. She nodded, professional as always, but I saw the glint of curiosity in her eyes. Something changed. Something became clear, I said. I left my modest savings to the winter's program. Not the house I'd walked away from. Not the people who once called me grandma like it was a job title. But the garden, the teens, the program that helped young women find their voices before someone taught them to quiet down. I also added Maya's name. She didn't know. She wouldn't know, not until the time was right. But if the world ever failed her again, she'd have something waiting, something planted in hope. Eleanor and I sat on the porch that weekend, watching the wind chase leaves in lazy spirals across the courtyard. She wore her usual oversized sunglasses and was halfway through her second cinnamon scone. "Think they'll ever try again?" she asked. "Them," I said. "Of course," she smirked. "Maybe on your birthday. Maybe when someone gets married or someone else needs tuition. Let them try." "And what'll you do?" I smiled softly. "Nothing. Nothing. I'll be too busy living." One evening, I received a postcard. Just a photo of the old lake taken from across the water, the dock barely visible. No name, no message. Just my name written on the address side, and underneath it, "We see it differently now." I stared at it for a long time. I didn't throw it away. I didn't frame it. I slipped it into the side pocket of my gardening apron and forgot about it by morning. Because perspective isn't the same as apology, and recognition isn't the same as redemption. At Silver Pines, the Winters program grew. Girls came and went, but their stories lingered. Some stayed in touch. Some disappeared off to college, to cities, to lives I would never see. That was the point. I didn't want them tethered to me like Brandon had been. I didn't want their growth to be measured by my approval. I wanted them to flourish and leave well. Unlike me, I'd waited a lifetime for permission to go. One cool October morning, I returned from the garden to find a letter on my pillow. It was from Maya. Not handwritten, typed with neat margins and a header that read, "For the woman who taught me that staying isn't always strength." Inside, she wrote about how she'd been accepted into a journalism program, how she'd told her story publicly at a teen summit in the city, how she'd quoted something I once said about silence not being the same as peace. She ended with this: "I know people say we owe everything to those who raised us, but I think we owe more to the ones who show us how to raise ourselves." I sat down, pressed the paper to my chest. This was my inheritance. Not applause, not forgiveness, but impact. The final journal entry I ever wrote read, "I was once afraid that disappearing meant failure, that stepping away meant surrender. But now I know disappearing from the wrong people is how you finally show up for yourself." And the silence I left behind wasn't a wound, it was a boundary. The following spring, I watched the garden bloom without needing to tend every inch myself. Other hands had taken up the tools. Other hearts now watered what I once planted. That's how you know you've done something right. When the thing you gave your soul to no longer depends on your pain to grow. Brandon, Amanda, Mark, maybe they'll tell their own version someday. Maybe they already do. Let them. I don't need to correct the record. Because I no longer live inside their story. I live inside my own.